connection between illiteracy and disinformation. I'm going to talk about the shocking connection today. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. For information about literacy and reading from a global perspective, please like and subscribe. So, in recent years, there has been a rise in what's called disinformation. And what that means is that information that isn't true, but people put it out there on social media or even sometimes in some news reports, and it's not true, but yet it's believed by people. And you don't have to go far to find this. All over the political news, there's a lot of information now about immigrants. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. That's false. There's the famous quote by Trump during the debate, and then later said by J.D. Vance. He said that, Haitians eat cats and dogs, and they've been stealing cats and dogs from people to eat them. That is ridiculous, and there's no evidence about it at all. Yet people believed that. There's information about vaccines out there. There's always been disinformation out there. I think back to the 80s and the 90s when I was growing up. There were all this information about celebrities. There were a lot of rumors about Michael Jackson and Tom Cruise and all these things and people in their private lives. But we're at the point now where it's becoming dangerous. Studies have actually shown that 67% of students are not able to tell the difference between an ad and a news article. So students are so easily persuaded now. People will just believe anything, and this is becoming a big problem. Now, how does that tie in with literacy? Well, literacy promotes what we call critical thinking skills. So when you read, critical thinking skills are the ability to analyze, to evaluate, to make inferences. That means to make an educated guess about something that may not be obvious. And those are all skills that could be called critical thinking skills. And so when people read and they use those skills, they become critical thinkers. So even if you have something that you see, on TV or that you hear, if you have read a lot, then that will help you to know what is real and what is disinformation. To distinguish between the two. And there's actually a study that was done on college students in Pakistan that actually found that critical reading, in other words, doing things like making analysis and reading and evaluating, it was correlated with critical thinking skills. And of course, this totally makes sense because when you practice something, it ends up happening. So you practice reading, and you end up thinking. Now, what was interesting about this study was it also found that the attitude towards critical thinking actually affected students' ability to think critically. So in other words, if students thought that it was important to be able to have these skills, to analyze, to evaluate, to make judgments, draw conclusions, all of these things, then they were more likely to do that. And so this is interesting to me for many, many reasons. If you watch any of my previous videos, you probably catch up pretty quickly that I'm very concerned about a lot of things in education today, particularly about reading education. And one of the things that concerns me is this trend towards away from authentic reading, this trend towards decoding only, especially at the lower grades, and not teaching reading strategies. So people are using this under the umbrella of science of reading. Some people are not. That's actually a very broad term, and people use it different ways. So people are saying, that every reading problem is a decoding problem, and that students just need to be taught explicitly. Trend away from reading large amounts of text, a trend away from reading strategies that help students, which was kind of a big thing in the 80s and the 90s. And so the idea that we don't have students learning these reading strategies and learning these critical thinking strategies, I believe, is one main factor that's going towards students and towards people in general, believing disinformation. Because in the past, people used to read widely, both in school and out of school. So in the past, people in my family who maybe worked on a farm or people who worked in factories, they read a lot, even if they had jobs that didn't necessarily require a lot of reading. Things that we would call blue-collar jobs that were not academic in nature. They didn't require a lot of reading and writing. People would still generally read. And I did some work when I was in college in coal mining communities where there were coal miners who, generally speaking, did not have a lot of educations. And all these communities had a newspaper. And most of them had a library, and that was very heavily used in these communities because they didn't have internet, they didn't have TV for the most part. People read. And we have gotten so far away from that we're starting to see a lot of disinformation. And if you also follow me, one of my first videos was on the PISA test. A PISA test is the Program of International Student Assessment. It's the global test that tests students in multiple countries around the world. And what it's found is that we now have some of the lowest scoring students in history, historically low. So students who are advanced learners, what you might call gifted learners, students who might take honors or AP classes, they're doing fine for the most part. There has not been a huge drop in performance in those students. But the students who are really struggling are those at the very bottom, those who score the lowest. You now have the biggest difference ever between students who are higher scoring and students who are lower scoring since the test began in the early 1970s. Illiteracy is causing a lot of problems. And of course I could go on and on about how it contributes to health issues, economic issues, of course poverty, but this is one thing that I feel like is being ignored, which is the role of reading and critical thinking and the need to read critically. So, if you're a teacher out there or a parent or a homeschool parent, what are some ways that you work with your students to gain critical thinking skills? And what are some ways that you think that we can bring back critical thinking in the schools at this moment when it seems like it's pretty rare? I would love to hear your comments. So please comment in the description box in the comments, and I would love to talk to you. Until next time, keep learning.